Good afternoon. I'm Ann Phibbs, Director of Education in the Office for Equity and Diversity. Welcome to Hit 'Em Again, Is Violence an Essential Thread in the Fabric of American Society? Our sixth conversation in this year's Critical Conversations about Diversity and Justice series. And I want to welcome those folks who are gathered on the East Bank. The School of Public Health Student Senate decided to host a viewing, and so we're excited that they're interested and clearly see this as a public health issue, so we welcome them. The Critical Conversation series is co-sponsored by the university libraries. The libraries have developed a list of further academic resources on each of our Critical Conversation topics, which you can link to on our Critical Conversations webpage. We're now finishing up our fourth year of offering these conversations, planning our fifth year, and we're excited to continue offering live streaming so that you can watch via our website in real time or at a later date, since they will be archived on our Critical Conversations webpage. And we've also added an opportunity for you to provide feedback on this series. If you signed in, we'll email you a link to an online evaluation, or you can also find a link there on the website. As with all our conversations, we'll start with some discussions among our panelists and moderator, and then move it out to the audience for some question and answer. So I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's conversation, Julie Showers. Julie Hagan Showers is a native Minnesotan. She graduated from Stanford University and the University of Minnesota Law School. After law school, she passed the bar in both Minnesota and California and practiced law for several years as a trial lawyer at Robbins, Kaplan, Miller, and Cerisi. In 1992, she joined Northwest Airlines and held several positions in labor relations before becoming vice president of labor relations in 2000. In that position, Julie was responsible for the negotiations and administration of 10 collective bargaining agreements covering 50,000 employees. In 2007, she transitioned to an operational role and became responsible for the operation of 10 domestic and 11 international flight attendant bases, as well as global catering and in-flight entertainment as Senior Vice President of In-Flight Services. Following the merger with Delta Airlines, Julie elected to remain in Minnesota and return to private practice at labor and employment boutique firm Ford Harrison, where she advised clients in all areas of employment law and dispute resolution. So she was well equipped when she moved over here to the University of Minnesota as director of the Office for Conflict Resolution, a position she's held since 2014. She lives in Minnetonka with her husband Eric, an obstreperous Catahoula puppy, Bud, and has 2 kids. Jason is a junior at the University of Minnesota, and Callan is a freshman at Stanford University. Please welcome our moderator, Julie Showers.
Thank you, Anne. Thank all of you for taking time out of your day to be here with us, both the people in this room, the people on the East Bank, and everyone who is watching through live streaming. I apologize up front for my voice, okay? I very, very much wanted to be here, so I'm taking this as a sign from the cosmos that I should speak as little as possible and allow the focus to remain on our panelists, who I welcome. As you see, we're missing one panelist. Hopefully he'll be able to arrive and just join us midstream. I will identify the panelists, but then in keeping with what I said, I'm going to ask them to briefly introduce themselves to you. So sitting closest to me is Zeem Porter. Zeem is a transgender, gender nonconforming high school student and activist in anti-bullying and safe school initiatives. Welcome, Zeem. Thank you for taking time to be with us. Sitting next to Zeem is Dallas Drake, the executive director of the Center for Homicide Research. And on the far left, my far left, is Lindsay Middlecamp, an assistant city attorney for the city of Minneapolis and a rape and sexual assault survivor and activist. So if the 3 of you would be so kind to help me out, and please just tell our audience a little more about you, your experience, your lived experience, how you come to be a part of our panel today.
So I'll start off. My name is Zeem Porter. She's so lovely said. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a little nervous, so bear with me. But I'm a senior at the Blake School, and I've been in the activist community, lucky enough, since I was 12 years old. I'm now 18. I was on the governor's anti-bullying task force after the anti-bullying bill passed. So I'm lucky enough to be on that, as well as a co-author of many workshops that really to the arts of creative arts or creative writing, because I believe gender expression and sexuality should be explored through the arts, especially as a youth, because that's how we gain our voice back as well as have more representation. And I just want to say shout out to Demi Boys of Color, because being genderqueer is real and is important, and the violence we face should be talked about.
Well said. My name is Dallas Drake. I'm from the Center for Homicide Research, which is located just a couple of miles down University Avenue. We're not affiliated with the University of Minnesota. We're an independent nonprofit organization. Our sole mission is to conduct statistical research on homicide to find ways of solving and preventing homicide. Our founding mission was gay homicide, and we've since that time opened up to a lot of different topics. In addition to that, I also review homicide cases for law enforcement agencies and help give direction as to what they need to do to solve their case. And I train homicide investigators across the United States. And I was in the Aurora, Colorado police station 1 week before the theater shooting, which was across the street. A lot of different kinds of things. I believe it was 2013, I received the Brian Coyle Award from the Human Rights Campaign for current and past activism that I've done. And I know a lot about homicide, so if you have any questions about homicide, I will try to answer them.
I've got my phone. I do not know a lot about homicide, so direct them to Dallas. My name is Lindsay Middlecamp, and sorry to start with a disclaimer, but I am not here in my professional capacity for my current employer, but I'm here in a couple different capacities. This chair was originally supposed to be occupied by a wonderful local woman named Sarah Super, who in 2015 courageously allowed herself to be named when she testified against her rapist, who had raped her at knife point after breaking into her apartment, an ex-boyfriend. I got to know Sarah, and I'm continuing to get to know her and benefit from her wonderful leadership in the survivor community through a series of events that she leads and hosts called Break the Silence events, which are aimed at destigmatizing and providing a supportive environment for sexual assault and rape survivors, which I am. I do have some professional tie-ins to the topics we're going to talk about today and to sexual violence. Although it's not my predominant practice, my pro bono practice when I was in private practice involved impact litigation where sexual violence and housing rights intersect. So 2 clients who have given me permission to use their stories at events like these include one woman whose family was subject to a brutal attack after her son began bullied at school because of his mother's status as a lesbian. And at one point that escalated to where a group of bullies came to the home and stabbed family members. And so the next day she was served with an eviction notice indicating that although you were the victim of the crime, we don't really want to have anything to do with this kind of problem. So we took that litigation and made sure that she and her family were able to stay in safe housing. Another place where sexual violence and housing intersected for my practice was a client who was subjected to years of sexual harassment and abuse, eventually fleeing a domestic relationship to housing she thought was safe, found that that landlord had specifically rented to her for the purpose of continuing to abuse and sexually harass her because he identified her as a vulnerable single mother with certain indicators that he typically rented to. After an attempted assault, she took her young children, fled to new housing, and it was only several years and a federal lawsuit later that we were able to get her a semblance of justice. I'll note that that landlord continues to manage many properties in the Twin Cities, and she is not the only woman who has reported that type of conduct. So I have some personal connections to these subjects and some professional connections, and I'm happy to talk about some of the legal frameworks and policy issues that I think will overlap with the other panelists, but maybe be a slightly distinct perspective.
Thanks to each of you. For those who've been at prior conversations, you know our format is typically to have the panelists address a couple of questions that I will pose, and we will try to save plenty of time for questions from our audience as well. You know, it is hard these days to turn on the TV or to open a newspaper without seeing an abundance of coverage of various sorts of violence, from acts of global violence, violence nationally, individual acts of violence, And for me, at least, it is wearying. It leaves you thinking that these are truly the times that try men's souls. And so as I prepared for this, there were a number of different ways we could approach the conversation, I think. And for my first question, I want to just call out some of those things. There are a number of factors in America today that perpetuate a culture of violence. Our children play violent video games. Action films on TV and in theaters present graphic acts of violence with frightening detail. News media has been characterized as using a "if it bleeds, it leads" philosophy to their coverage of events. And that's informed by the prevalence of gun violence in the US. If you consider that there were 372 mass shootings in the US in 2015, more than one a day, killing 475 people and wounding 1,870, and 13,286 people were killed in the US by firearms, with 26,819 injured in 2015. And notably, those figures exclude suicide. There's increasing violence and increasing violent rhetoric happening around Donald Trump's campaign, both within his campaign and in responses to it. And yet many Americans would still characterize our country as a peace-loving nation tied to democratic ideals and reject the notion that instead our society is and always has been informed by violence. So where, in your opinion, does that disconnect come from? And what, if anything, can be done about it? It's up to you guys. Decide who speaks first.
Well, I was speaking with my mother before this, and I told her, like, I think what this question is really getting at is, like, why is our flag at half-mast so often? Like, why do I feel like when I go to bed that, like, you know, my heart is hurting? Like, why am I always in pain? And I know that I identify as a deep feeler and thinker and care about everyone. And so when I see on the news, especially when I see news about trans folks of color, because, like, that has a personal tie to me, I immediately think of the sociology term cognitive dissonance. Paul C. Gorski is an author, an academic, and professor who uses this term a lot, and it's really about how when we're introduced to something that goes against our ideals, or like systemic oppression that we have, or systemic violence that we have seen and have been ingrained and we have been marinating in forever, when it goes against that or provides key examples of throwing that violence back in our face, our first reaction is to tense up. I don't know if some of you feel this, but like even hearing about the shootings, that my body gets tense and I just want to reject it, because it either proves the fears that I have when I go to sleep at night, or it invites new ideals or new life experiences that I haven't thought about, that I've had the privilege not to think about. So I think that as a nation, specifically those with privileged identities, when you don't have to come in contact and you don't have to live those experiences of racism, of transphobia, of the binary system that we live in, when you don't have to directly be affected by that, when you're introduced to that, your first instinct is to tense up and look away. And that only allows it to occur more and perpetuate this cycle that we're in today. So I guess that's why a quick answer.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of Zim's comments. I think that it is this kind of reflexive need to distance ourselves and compartmentalize or categorize violence as unrelated to us that prevents us from having good conversations about what the next step is. In sexual violence, we see this a lot, where we pathologize rapists or assailants and say, well, that's just this deviant criminal person. That's not a normal person. I would never do that. My family would never do that. Never mind that statistics suggest that 4 out of 5 rapists are known to their victims, and that many rapists who are incarcerated are married, have families, owned a dog, went to the grocery store, had, might be a church leader or at your grocery store. So this need to say, well, that's not going to affect me or my community because I think I have an idea of who that person is, leads people to then instead say, well, what choices did the victim make that I could make differently or that I know better than to make? Because that's a more comfortable framework than the one that is uncomfortable, which is all of us are at risk of either being pretty closely related to the victim, not related in familial ways, but culturally, or worse, being really closely related to the perpetrators and excusing it. I think we see it in homicide too, where when we see reports of murders, the questions are, what part of town? What time of night? Was it gang or drug related? Because if we can answer those questions in a way that distances ourselves, then we don't have to have the harder conversation about how am I complicit? How am I either supporting structures indirectly, or how am I directly allowing this kind of violence to affect that community that I feel comfortable isn't my community? And then when it does affect our community, it's mental health or it's gun access, but it's never about these other factors. Certainly those are conversations, but I think we go through this almost exhausting series of mental gymnastics to say, that's not us, because as Zim put it, otherwise you get devastated by it, the weight of it. But that is a privilege. I think that those communities most affected don't have the privilege of saying that's not us because they're being affected most directly. So to answer what we do to stop it, I don't know, but I do think that there is a middle ground where you don't have to be completely overwrought with the gravity of violence, but also not so quick to distance yourself from it. When you hear a story, take a moment and resist the urge to say, well, that's that state or that's that community that was affected, and instead question, what role do I have in either this victim structure or this perpetrator structure?
Well, I wish that the question had been narrowed down a little bit, because this covers such a broad swath of the issues that we're going to talk about. And so I just want to talk about a couple of small parts. And because I'm from the Center for Homicide Research, I have to point out that the good news is we're at an all-time low for homicide in the United States, that we have fewer homicides than almost any year since the middle of the 1960s, including here in Minnesota. And so that's good news. How to keep it that way, that we don't know yet, okay? So we have some ideas about how to do that. I also want to mention that domestic violence has been in decline since 1993, and that by no means diminishes the issue. And everything these guys already said is very, very important, and there was nothing untrue said. But because domestic violence is in decline, we have to take a look at that. And when you get a closer look, you find out that domestic violence against males has declined, but much less so for females. So the problem of domestic violence impacting female victims is still there. And so that's an issue. A third thing that I would say, based on the synopsis that you presented, is that we have something going on in society right now that we haven't had for a little while, and that is a change in technology. And it's akin to the change from the horse to the electric motor. Now we're changing from the Industrial Revolution to the information age. And in the course of that, it's dramatically impacting what we know, how we know it. The posting of violent videos to people's Facebook accounts. There was one that was just on CNN this morning where some juveniles, a whole group of juveniles, got in a kind of a group fight, and someone died from that. And they posted this online. So you can go online and see this. And that's not an uncommon thing. If you go over to to St. Paul Police, they have a live data room that's part of their dispatch center. It's live data. In other words, they have crime analysts who go online and look at the Facebook accounts of various people as they hear the calls going out, and check to see if they're gang members, check to see what they've been up to lately, check to see if they've made threats against anybody. But this change in technology is something that we really have not looked at. We've underestimated the impact that it's having on people as it propagates violent culture. But it's also part of the solution. This is where we win the war against ISIS. This is where we win the battle against domestic violence. These are places where we educate people. And if we just stop and kind of back up for a minute and think about it in a new light, we can do all kinds of things that we haven't done before. And with that, I'll pass.
Zim, you want to add something? Of course.
Thank you. I just want to add to this because you all are helping me just building connections. But I first want to say too that I think we need to be very critical at research, just because we know that like for trans women of color, like that's finally started being done. Just how many of them are being murdered? Like I know in my community, like every day people are checking in on me because as a trans person of color, like in my community, we can expect for a sibling or a sister to be killed at least once a week. And like new evidence is coming out about just how much like trans women are dying, trans women of color are dying. And I think too, to your point that you were bringing up, like we do have this culture of blaming the victim and being like, okay, well, what was she doing, or what were they doing? What part of town is this in? Like, what is that? And not truly listing out the things of like, what is causing this violence? Like, what aspects of racism allow it for me to see a black person get hurt on Facebook and not feel like, oh my gosh, like a person is being affected. It's just seeing this as a Facebook post. Like, what part of transphobia is allowing me to first worry about like a person's genitalia and not worry about their safety, about their healthcare system? Like, what aspects of this, like in my brain, like what systemic oppression has been ingrained into my heart, into my mind, to first worry not about the violence that they are facing, but about the political issues, about the academic, like what is it saying academic-wise? Like in an academic culture nowadays, it's like, okay, how is this victim not just a, like first, let's use this language, this person isn't a victim, this person is just a key of or just highlighting the violence in the way that we talk, or like in the way that we say that, or like, and plus two, when we're speaking on this panel, I hope that we know that too, like there's a whole bunch of violence that is glorified or is seen as great because of who's committing it, especially when it's like at the hands of police officers or the hands of institutions. Even some education systems are instilling violence into our culture. So I think that a lot of times it's not only talking about what violence is being seen and glorified, but like what is behind that, like what systems are glorifying this, are perpetrating this, or even committing it themselves, and how are we actually the ones holding the knife? How are we the ones, like even if it's just mental or like, you know, metaphorical, like in what aspects are we the ones causing the violence?
Thank you, Zim. Let me welcome our final panelist to the panel. This is Oliver Williams. Dr. Williams is a professor here at the University of Minnesota School of Social Work, whose research focuses on domestic violence. And Dr. Williams, I'd invite you just to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your work, and then maybe to share your perspective. Your co-panelists were answering the question, what about this disconnect between the violence that's embedded and pervasive in American culture and our desire to sort of deny that and instead espouse sort of peace-loving democratic values?
Well, I apologize for being late. I have a medical issue that I had to take care of, and it made me a little bit late.
We are glad you're here now.
I'm glad to be here. Among the things that I think about with this issue is the fact that it is true that the issue of domestic violence is something that has more prominence in the United States than in a lot of other countries. I've had a lot of people from a lot of parts of the world come to the United States to try to figure out what it is that we're doing so they can try to respond to the problem and reduce it. That's a good thing. But there are challenges within the United States. So even though our numbers have reduced, in many ways, there's still different pockets of within diverse communities that are still challenged by the issue. And it depends on whether or not, what message we're sending, not only to ourselves, but to the rest of the world. So if you look at low-income, high-stress communities that are more policed, you might find higher rates of violence. The question is, are we attending to those issues? And even though they may have been reduced to some extent, they're still higher than the rest of the population. When we deal with immigrant and refugee communities, do we understand the realities? We did a report on, and the United Nations did a report that said that addressing domestic violence in communities of color within the United States is a challenge. And it's a challenge largely because sometimes we really don't know the story. So the question is, if you're trying to figure out how to engage some communities that feel reluctant to come to environments to talk about it or feel as though their stories are being understood, or whether or not those helping systems can respond to the issues and challenges that they're dealing with, it's reduced. Or whether or not we think that the systems that we have up are resources and not intrusions. And they may be helpful. I've worked in the field for a number of years, over 35 years. So I know that Battered Women's Organization saves people's lives. I know that batterers interventions can help to reform and change some men. But what I get challenged by is when you don't know the stories and know what issues to confront and what issues to acknowledge in terms of helping people think about it. Or what about Native American communities? When you deal with issues associated with sexual assault, there are women who are being harmed, and the people that are harming them that are from either Native American communities or outside of Native American communities can get away with being abusive and not be held to account for the abuse that they do. So, or what about having batterers intervention programs that are not, and you provide it for people that speak different languages, and you don't have the people who speak those languages to communicate those issues to the people that you're trying to serve. There are a number of issues that we need to look at in the consequence of being effective. And I think that what we've done is that we have a message that we um, share across the United States, which is a good message, but it has its limits in terms of understanding who it is that you are responding to and dealing with the challenges that each community faces. One thing I think about is a lot of programs feel comfortable providing services and telling people around the world, you should do it our way. A lot of people say you should do things. But the thing of it is the fact that they sometimes don't norm it on the populations that they're serving. So Ellen Pence, who's from Minnesota, who passed away a couple of years ago, came up with the power and control wheel. And we see that on TV programs. We tout that in different places around the world. But one of the things that Ellen talked about, I said, Ellen, so as we're having conversations about diversity, she said, you should norm it on the population that you're serving. A lot of people don't know that there was another woman that passed away that worked with Ellen called Radia Jabber. And Radia ended up creating a focus on the Duluth model and working with men who batter that was shaped around the African American sort of reality. And when Ellen developed it, she developed it for low-income white men and Native American men. And the power and control wheel has one model that we're familiar with, but she ended up getting contributions from 281 different countries talking about how the power and control wheel could be framed from their community's perspective. So the thing that we don't do enough of is to be able to understand what issues you need to address to find out what things you acknowledge and what things that you confront. And I can say more about that, but I'll just start.
Well, let me note, a number of you have touched on in your comments the identities or the intersectionality of identities that we hold that influence the way we move through the world and we perceive events that affect us and those that affect us around us in our communities, our workplaces, and the world. I want to call out on the panel, some of you have been the direct victims of violence as a result of identities you hold, and some of you work to reduce violence targeted at or experienced by individuals based on those identities. In the face of the suggestions we have that American culture is becoming more rather than less violent, how do you hold on to hope? Brian Stevenson tells us that one of the important pieces of work in social justice is to hold on to your hope. So how do you do that? And what can we do in the audience and in our online audience? What can we do as allies to support survivors and reduce violence in our families, neighborhoods, communities, and our broader society?
Well, for me, one of the things that I see as hopeful is when I ended up seeing people who can tell a story, embrace the issue. So so we talk about Islam. So we work in Christianity and we work with Islam. And as we do work with that, there's a imam in New York. On the one side it says Imam T.A. Bashir, but on the back he's got the power and control wheel. So when we talk to people who examine the issue and they see that it's an important issue that we have to challenge from their perspective is something that's real important. Imam Kanadi, that's in another imam, African imam in New York, who addresses the issue, but people in his community see him as a very important person to talk to when there's domestic violence circumstances. Or we look at Reverend Dr. Sharon Ellis Davis, who was a former battered woman. She was a policewoman. Then she became the chaplain of Chicago Police Department. Started to tell the church her story, but do the work in the church. We're working with 4 different churches. That is an example. We have a project called Speaking of Faith. And in that environment, what they say is that ministries have to change in terms of how you engage people to think about the problem, but also think about the solution. So among the different ministries that they have to address different issues, many of the churches have domestic violence ministries. They grew Bishop Roderick Mitchell in the Mississippi Delta ended up creating a rape crisis line in his church. And he says, and he's a bishop, so he has 32 other churches he's got some responsibility for. And he says, if you're going to be a part of this church, this is an issue that you're going to deal with, because he grew up in a household where there is domestic violence. He knows the story. And then when you see women who, there's been a history of churches that haven't been responsive, but there are beginning to be more churches that add this to the ministry of things that they focus on. And I think sometimes we've had a bad history with regard to churches, because women would go there and then the church either didn't accurately understand what was going on, it gave them bad information. But churches and kind of mosques can be places that could be positive in terms of talking to people about the appropriate way to be able to think about male relationships to women, but also what we need to do in terms of social justice to support women. That doesn't mean that it happens in a lot of places or enough places, but you're asking me what gives me hope. And what gives me hope is when you see people that understand how you need to sort of approach the issue and change and transform. And when there are more people who can validate that truth. What's interesting, we did a study in Africa, and when I went to Africa, and even though a lot of my colleagues who are African that we work with will talk about different philosophies about the work, among the things that they'd also talk about is you need to understand our reality before, and our approaches to looking at the world, and then you can help us to reframe and think about what you're doing. But when we think about going to Africa, you also have to think about there's a lot of African immigrants and refugee folks that come to the United States who bring the traditions and the values with them. Not just African, but people from all over the world. And we have to be able to challenge and acknowledge and to confront issues from their perspective in their voice. And it still means that violence against women is wrong. Still means that what we have to do is find ways to be help women have safe and supportive environments, and to hold men accountable. But there are opportunities to be able to do that, and not again just from Africa, but from places all over the world.
So I think there's basically 2 points to your question. One, like hope, and then also like action, like what can we do? Touching on the hope thing, I think being able to be up here and identify as a survivor as well is hope, just because like I'm here, right? And alive. Being able to be alive every day gives me hope, but also art. And I think that as a society, sometimes we don't value art enough because we see it as only glorifying violence. We don't see it as like taking your voice back, having your voice be validated. Too often, I think that, like, I know personally, and I can only speak for myself, but I only see people like me as victims or vigilantes, not having our voice validated. So when we have our art, like when my poetry or others or other work is out there and validated and our voice is heard and is not into those two camps of, oh, I'm just a victim or I'm just a vigilante. That gives me hope. Other youth give me hope. Meeting people younger than me who put me in my place give me hope. Um, and then I also think that we need to touch upon that recognizing and like being able to hear other people recognize the historical trauma that they have faced or people like them have faced. Also, moving away from the term ally and accomplice gives me hope, because then people recognize that, hey, racism affects me too. Like being white, like, and not being, having privilege and not being blind to so many things has a problem with me too. Like me not being able to connect to you and maybe racism getting in the way of me seeing you as a human being impacts me just as much as it impacts you. Like I have heartache too, like, and I'm causing you violence, which is in turn causing myself violence. I think gives me hope. And as a direct action, I think as far as what other people can do is like seeing yourself as a co-conspirator, realizing that like even as a man, the patriarchy hurts me. You know, like why do I have to kill the femme aspects of myself in order to be a man? Like how do I be a co-conspirator, sir, on all fronts? How do I be an accomplice on all fronts to see that oppression hurts all people? And I might have the privilege to think that it doesn't hurt me, but it's also limiting and causing me to wear chains as well. I think too, just the aspect of like having panels like this is tremendous amount of hope. And even just studies coming out that, you know, in my generation, only 48% of people would say that I'm just straight. Not that there's like some gay agenda, but like knowing that more people are open and honest and being like, wait, this binary system has been in place for far too long. Like there are more genders and sexualities. You know what I mean? Even people questioning, like, why is there just man or woman? Or why is there violence? Like, is it wrong for me to just assume from my place? Like, how do I take it out? How can I get outside of myself and outside of my narcissism in order to see what is truly here, in order to see others, in order to see oppressions that are affecting other people? And I think all those things coming together is what gives me hope, as well as just people inviting people to eat. Like so much of our culture comes from food. So much of our culture comes from dialogue and conversation. Like the more tables I see filled, the more plates I see filled, and the more tears as well as mouths full of food and voice, the happier I am and the happier I think the entire world will be, not to be cheesy.
I also feel a lot of hope, and I think that there are a lot of cultural movements that are all getting a lot of ground right now that, although have different platforms, all are kind of universally saying, I'm tired of this particular form of oppression or violence being in the shadows. It is not constructive to ignore it, so we're going to demand attention and action. So whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement or increased LGBTQI identity, or being visible in political movements and in social movements, I think that those insistences that the issues be dealt with and upfront and not put to the curb. I think Minnesotans especially have kind of a bad track record of not wanting to be direct in our conflict or our conflict resolution. And so culturally, seeing those kind of movements, or the It's On Us movement that's attempting to put accountability for campus sexual violence across everyone and not just the few people who want to show up to this particular support group that day, those types of trends are very encouraging and I think are fueled but not, they existed before social media, but social media is really accelerating that. And so I'm thrilled about that. I'm thrilled that public health department is streaming right now, because the more we talk about this as a public health issue, as well as a social justice and political and legal issue, I think the more we can all connect to it and see how it affects us. Like Zim said, you know, as a white person, I'm also having a lot of ills from racism. As men, you're also having a lot of ills from patriarchy. So connecting to how we're all better off and the rising tide raises all ships kind of mentality, I think, is hope-inducing. I also think that there is some hope in terms of statistics that supposed increases in violence might actually not always indicate increases in violence, but rather increase of attention. So one example, Minneapolis came under flack a few years ago for having extremely high rape rates. Compared to other cities of this size and compared to its historic rates. It looked like we were having a rape crisis. Now, I would argue any amount of rape should be treated like a rape crisis, but what came out is that Minneapolis was being more inclusive than was required by including male rape, which many cities were not, and which was not actually under the FBI definition. and other forms such as incest and statutory rape, forms of sexual assault that were being ignored because they didn't meet a certain definition. And policy leaders at the city level, as far as I understand it, came to a point where they said, I don't care what the definition is, this is a problem, this is a form of sexual violence, so we're going to report it whether it looks bad or not. Eventually, I think that was stepped back from a little bit, so we may or may not lump them all together, but it is that commitment to facing the truth rather than categorizing it in a more palatable way that gives me hope. The other thing that I'll say about what we can and should do, particularly from the angle of sexual violence, is something that I'm seeing more and more, and part of why I really admire the panelist I'm replacing, Sarah Super, for doing and facilitating, which is creating an environment where people feel safe talking about the violence they've already experienced. We might not ever be able to fully prevent violence, but a recurring theme at these Break the Silence events is the re-victimization. The idea that sexual violence happens, and it's terrible, but then it's the telling of your family or the feeling like there's no capacity to tell your family, or their reaction and your friends and the ostracization that happens and the stigma. That re-victimization ends up being as, if not more, traumatic for people who experience violence. And so the more we can create cultures that facilitate that conversation and support. I'll say for me, my personal connection to sexual violence started very young. I was about 4 or 5 years old, and a much older teenage boy, family friend, close family friends of my parents, their son, took me down in the basement and sexually assaulted me. I was very lucky to have parents who never once blamed me, who made it clear very early on, this is not your fault. And years later, when I was a college student and experienced acquaintance rape, even with that backdrop of familial support, I did not feel like I could tell my parents what had happened. I didn't pick up the phone and call anyone. And unbeknownst to me, my sister, who also didn't feel like she could tell anyone, had been assaulted on her campus. She did report it to her campus and was told, you know, this guy's pre-med, he's a really good guy, you're gonna ruin his future, do you really wanna go forward with this, by the student advocate. So we see these systems in place and the importance that a single friend or a single brave person or a single supportive ear can have on victims as they go forward in becoming leaders. I'll say I'm a very outspoken feminist and an advocate in a lot of areas, but it wasn't until I'd heard other people speak about their specific instances that I got to a point where I can shakily share these experiences with a room. And my hope is that to the extent there are survivors in this room, this kind of conversation will, you don't have to talk about it, but will make you feel like there's an option and there are places to go to talk about it. So the action homework I would direct is do whatever you can to create an environment in your own household, in your workplace, in your school communities, wherever you are, the spaces you navigate. That doesn't mean go up to people and say, hey, have you been victimized? I want you to talk about it and put it on parade. That would not be good. But create a culture that encourages dialogue, support policies like affirmative consent policies, because I think that those end up providing a great deal of education and toolkits for both potential perpetrators and potential survivors, and just be open to the conversation.
Yeah.
Get to this end, and I'm not sure if I remember the question, but I guess it's about solutions, right? And first we have to know what the problem is. And one of the first things I learned in homicide was that there are many kinds of homicide, and there's many kinds of crimes. And so what prevents a burglary is not going to prevent a child murder. Okay? And so when we look at, even within a stigmatized, disempowered, disenfranchised group, there are many kinds of things that can happen to us. And first we have to know what that is, and then someone has to come up with a solution that is specifically tailored for that crime. The easier answer, or well, I don't know if it's easier, the simpler answer is that a lot of the crime that happens, of all kinds, happens in areas that are experiencing poverty and unequal social economic status. And those are not easy things to deal with, right? It's like, how do we make everybody middle class again? That's not an easy thing to do. But the intimate partner violence, I believe, happens more among lower class. It still happens in upper class people and among wealthy folks, but not as often. And so we know what this is. if you go out to Edina, there's a lot less homicide, right? As opposed to, say, South Minneapolis in the Phillips neighborhood. So I think a lot of the solution is going to center on personal decisions that we make, each one of us. When I decide how to live my life today, I decide to help out somebody who has no groceries this week. And that, actually, I was brought up that way, but it makes perfect sense. When you see someone in need, you help them. Now, I'm not talking about giving coins to meth dealers that are out on the street corner. We've had some of those, some people who are in halfway houses and out on the street corner. But there's many other things that you can do. One of the things that tends to create criminality is social isolation. If I think back, there are lots of people in my community that, I go to an event, someone's standing off in the corner alone. They're not being included, and especially at LGBT events. And I had a very direct conversation with some of them, some of the folks one year at it was the Lesbian and Gay Pride Grand Marshal's ball or dinner or whatever they call it, and they were doing it there. And I walked right up and broke into the group of people and asked them about it. And then I went around and I thanked all the people who were serving us that night. And they're like, well, we're paid to do that. I said, yes, I know. You're obviously not out where you want to be. You're not doing what you want to do. That's something that we can do, and it takes a lot of character and internal strength to be able to face things like that. It is not an easy thing to do. And one of the things that happened to me was when the homicide problem in North Minneapolis was really bad, some mad dads came up to me and said, you want to walk through the neighborhood with us? Now, they had no idea who I was, and I did not tell them. I just said, I live in South Minneapolis. And so we walked through the neighborhood, and I learned a lot. And some of it was frightening. There were some guys who got very aggressive, and they thought I was a cop, which I'm not. And they said, why are you here? What are you doing up in our neighborhood? And, I just told them the truth. I said, well, I don't believe it's right for little girls to be murdered. And it had been after one of the youngsters had been killed. And just told them the truth. And when we got done, they were laughing and joking and shaking my hand, and we went about our way. But that was not an easy walk for me. It was a very good walk. And we all have things like that we can do from time to time. Sometimes stepping in when you hear somebody say something that is off color or outright prejudiced, you rise up and say something. You are the interrupter. You interrupt that and you say something. You say, I don't believe that's acceptable to speak like that. I don't accept that. I don't do that. We don't tolerate that. But once again, you got to put yourself out on the line. And none of us wants to do that. Each one of us, I think, just holds the solution right here. And then, of course, we get to tell all of our friends and share with it. Because when you go out with friends, what do? You talk about what you learned today. Well, I'll tell you what I learned today, right? This is what I learned today. I'll pass.
I do want to push back a little bit on the idea, and I know this isn't what Dallas was saying that's the only way, but I don't think you should have to drive to a neighborhood that you view as other than yours to say, well, I want to see what violence means or looks like, in the sense that when we go to the polling place, when we make policy decisions, when we go about our daily lives in historically segregated neighborhoods and continually segregated workplaces, we are creating that violence. We don't need to drive to the neighborhoods that maybe the issue arose 50, 100 years ago and has continued. So I would urge that rather than just physically taking a drive, go through that exercise. And I realize this is a little political, but you asked, how does Trump contribute to this issue? I think the idea that we don't have a responsibility to be constantly examining the policies and the laws that we support and the structures that we participate in, the idea that it is limited to that neighborhood and it didn't start in my neighborhood is a problem. Particularly as a privileged white person, I think that is something that I'm trying to do more intentionally, and I think is valuable.
Oliver, I know you want to make a comment. I'd ask you to do it quickly because we want to get questions from the audience as well. You can, also quickly.
Oh, I just want to build upon that too. Thank you for saying that. Like the bills of we have here in St. Paul right now too, just like the gender bathroom bills. Like I don't know about you, but I'm terrified. Like not just because of myself as a trans person, but like the fact that like there's a bill right now about my genitalia, about what bathroom I go to. That's scary. That is violence against me enacted every single day and people like me. The fact that even, you know, my mother as a cis woman does not understand, could not understand that pain. There's a bill about my genitalia, about mine, about someone sitting here, about my friends, about people I know, you know, about trans people here. Like my mom doesn't even know like how personal, like there's something being debated right now in some big ivory tower just to see, so that I don't have to like, about me being safe in a restroom, about other people, about me being seen as a pervert. And then also too, like as a Minneapolis, as living on the north side and being a resident of the north side, I think it's important too to mention that like, crimes don't just happen in low-income areas. Like there's, like what is our definition of crime? Because there's been crimes committed in with people like white-collar crimes or stuff. Like what are we seeing? Like who are we criminalizing even more? Like addiction is real. Addiction should not be seen as a crime just because someone has a drug addiction. That is a medical issue. That is an illness. And I think that we really need to like do some self-work as well as look inside ourselves. Like if we have money, like why aren't we giving to organizations like the National GSA Network, which I am a part of, so you might call me biased, or like even like youth-ran organizations like the Black Liberation Project. If you don't know who Joe B. Adams is, I think you need to look him up and you need to figure out who he is, because he is a youth in our community, black trans male who is leading the community and hates being called a leader, but that's what he is. And he puts his life on the line every single day and asks for nothing in return. No ally cookies, no accomplice cookies, not even a cookie for himself, sometimes not even his safety. So I think that it's remembering that like the points that we're talking about, like even just admitting that you're a survivor, like I almost teared up. Like we need to think about the cognitive dissonance in this room right now. Like someone shared their story with us when they were harassed, and like I don't know about you, but like I had a heartache, gut-wrenching pain. Like we need to keep that pain in us all the time and use it to fuel us and see people as human beings and make sure we know that at all times that what we say impacts people, and that these issues aren't just something that we have to debate on a panel, but they're like impact real people's lives.
I want to give you some resources. One person who's talked about 4 generations of domestic violence, and okay, is that better? I'm sorry, I got a soft voice. There's a person who has written a book about 4 generations of domestic violence and how they kept the silence within the family and how they struggled to do it from mother to daughter, from grandmother to mother to daughter to granddaughter. And the name of the book is called Color Me Butterfly by a woman named L.Y. Marlowe. Very powerful story. Another person who's done some really good work to address campus violence and sexual assault is a man named Chuck Derry. And you can contact him through Praxis International that's in St. Paul, Minnesota. But he and his colleague came up with something called the best party model. And what happens is, how do you end up having parties and have people get a chance to celebrate being youthful, but at the same time be concerned about women's welfare, and also have conversations about how do you make sure that she's protected, and that there's these different strategies that women have when they go to parties about keeping each other safe. And what can men do to try to address that? My son, when he was in college, asked me to identify some people that could help him think it through for his fraternity. And Chuck was a person's a friend of mine, and we went up to his school and did a presentation associated with addressing those issues, something that was real good. I think the other thing that I wanted to comment on is the fact that, you know, I made the comment earlier that low-income, high-stress communities are over-policed. Also means that they call the police, but they sometimes call the police because there are few resources that exist within their communities. And that sometimes people have to make the choice about whether or not they're going to stay in environments where they can be victimized, or be homeless. And and that people who have more resources have more options about where they go. And you know, it was so interesting to me sometimes in different studies that we've done over the years. We end up looking at some of the rates without looking at what happens inside the review of the literature or the research that takes place. And sometimes we don't talk to the people who are affected by the problem in ways to understand their truth and their context and their reality. Um, so I won't say more about that unless you want me to say more about that. But I think that we have to be able to figure out how to get inside people's truths and realities and not feel as though there are some people who are off the hook. You know, when I talk about working with men who batter in the courtroom, usually men who have financial substance, can get an attorney to help them to negotiate themselves out of problems. And that usually low-income men don't have those resources. And I always say I don't have a problem with who's there, I have a problem with who's not there. So if we know that the problem reaches everyone, we've got to find ways to hold everybody accountable. But we also have to find ways to be able to serve people who are not being served.
Okay, and with that, I will ask the audience for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and Anne will make sure you get a microphone and you can be heard.
Well, I don't have a question, maybe so much as a comment. I think the solution to a lot of this is education. And I think I'm afraid that we soften history too much. I was reading something recently where there are people who actually believe that the Holocaust either did not happen or has been greatly exaggerated. And having visited Dachau myself, you can still smell the scent of burnt flesh there, even after all these years. I have a very dear friend who has a relative who is educated. She has a bachelor's degree. She has 2 master's degrees, is a learned, caring person. And last year, after they went to see the movie 12 Years a Slave, as she walked out, she commented that she had not realized that slavery was so brutal. I'm like, really? Really? You're taught in school, I don't know what she was taught, but they make it almost sound like it was some kind of, cruise that people signed up for and came over here to work. And I said, you really thought that these people were all treated as members of the family? But a part of that, I think, is how we tell the story now. It's that same lack of education and misguidedness, I think, that allowed a public school system, I won't say which, but a public school system last year who bought a video game on slavery for the school children to play that allowed them to pretend to be a slave, and you got to pick whether you ate or slept, I mean, trivializing horrid circumstances. And I don't mean that I think we need to make our children have nightmares, but we have to tell the truth about what happens. And when we don't tell the truth, when we soften it, when we make it pretty and nice, that allows people to feel, I think, more removed from the situation and either allowed to pretend that it didn't happen and that it could not be repeated, but also to forget about it and dismiss it because it's been diminished.
Well said.
Thank you all so much for a very interesting discussion. And I think my comment might be related to the previous comment. I was thinking if I came here from another planet and I heard a panel discussion on whether violence is endemic to American society, I would have thought that a huge piece was missing. And it goes back to the Donald Trump thing. There was, as Ms. Summers announced, told us there was a reaction to Donald Trump inciting violence. But just a few weeks before that, every Republican candidate was on a stage trying to one-up each other in terms of inciting violence. Donald Trump said, well, we should kill their families. I think that meant children as well. Ted Cruz said, we ought to carpet bomb the desert until the sands glow. And there wasn't the same reaction to that. Of course, that violence is done in the name of states for national security. And it's kind of interesting that if you look in the United States Code, it's very difficult to find a definition of national security. There is no definition of national security in the National Security Act. And I did find the definition in the Foreign Terrorist Organization Act. And the definition there says that national security means national defense, foreign relations, or economic interests of the United States. So we justify killing as a group, as a collective, as a state, if someone threatens our economic interests. Now, I think on campus, on our own campus, now I know only two of you, Professor Williams and Ms. Summers, are on campus, but we have an organization, we have a department of military science that trains people and techniques to kill people when our economic interests, if someone interferes with my property. And we don't give that a second thought. There's no Department of Peace Studies on campus, but we have a Department of Military Science. And you don't have to be a pacifist to think that at an institution of higher education that's supposedly dedicated to searching for the truth, that it's kind of inappropriate to have a department that trains people to kill each other to protect property. If I could just make one more addition, throughout history, especially through the last century, the number of people killed in the name of states and by states dwarfs the number that are killed in individual homicides.
Up here, Ann.
So I want to start off by thanking the panelists, especially Zeem and Lindsay, for being brave enough to come and not only speak your truth, but also speak on behalf of people who may not be able to speak at this moment. That being said, I kind of want to bring up a point kind of related to what Chuck was saying about the violence that we're discussing. A lot of this violence is interpersonal violence, or violence that we are capable of affecting at least the reactions to, or the way that we view it. But I want to touch on top-down processes that occur that perpetuate violence, whether that's systemic racism or economic inequalities. The way that we look at violence filtering from the top down, and how we hold accountable systems and institutions which are perpetuating these violence, and in many cases creating them. How should we hold people accountable that are creating and maintaining these institutions?
Well, first off, we have to recognize what exactly is happening out there, and that crime is very interesting in that it creates its own structure. So when people say, I don't feel safe going into this neighborhood, it created that structure where I don't feel safe. It's changing which grocery store I go to, or you know, who I buy my pharmaceuticals from. And you'll find in almost any neighborhood that experiences a high rate of homicide, and I don't know as much about the other crimes, but there are always predatory capitalists at work. Predatory capitalists. And that predation encourages the violence, because people start to drink more, right? People don't buy as good of food, so their health isn't as good. It creates an entire structure where crime kind of makes sense. And if I lived in an area like that and grew up there, I know what the research shows. It shows I would be a homicide offender or I would be in prison for something. Because that's what happens in that environment. It's a created environment. It's a predatory environment. And there are other predators that operate within that system. It's kind of like an ecological niche. The serial homicide predators. I was called one time by the folks over in Flint, Michigan, and they wanted me to comment on what was happening there. And I said, they wanted me live on the radio. I said, oh no. I said, give me 2.5 hours. And I looked it up, and the first thing I noticed was they had just arrested a serial offender. That's why they're going over the top with their homicides. That was before I discovered the 2 other serial homicide predators in Flint for that same time period. And so they move, if they're not raised in that area, they're moving into that area. And that's not unlike what happens here at the University of Minnesota every fall. When you get a rape or a robbery over here in Dinkytown, and then you get 2, 3 more, and 2 more, and another, and when the police make the arrest, what do they say? We've arrested someone, but we're still looking. Because that's what's going on there. They're trying to cover for each other. They're covering for each other. And so then it creates this environment where they're being over-policed, right? And it's like, if I were a young African-American male, I wouldn't want to go out on my own on the street when there were so many police on the street, because I've actually seen what they do. I've been in the neighborhoods and seen them target children. All of that helps make criminals. When you put police resource officers in the schools, and then they start either arresting, in some cases arresting, or drawing kids into the juvenile justice system. They have records at early ages, and those records impact what kind of sentences they might get later, or if they're even considered a suspect, because they have a record, right? So I think that we need to start looking at the problem a little bit differently as almost ecosystems, right? And the criminals aren't the only predators out there, right?
I'm so glad you brought up this point. I was just geeking in my seat when you brought it up, because I think it is something we need to talk about. Crack versus cocaine. Why do you get a bigger sentence when it's when it's crack? Or like, let's even think about, why are there private investors in jails? Like why does our 13th Amendment actually allow for you to be in slavery once you have committed a crime? Why, like, let's be real here. The 13th Amendment doesn't actually end slavery, but just institutes it in a different way. And like, that's the prison industrial complex. Let's be honest about that. Let's talk about that. Let's also talk about why there's researchers who go into like low income schools and pick out the 3rd grade boys who are black and brown and say, all right, so now we know how many jails we need to build in the next 20 years. Like, you know, let's talk about why there's too many white teachers in these same schools and not enough black and brown teachers, not enough queer teachers, not enough queer trans teachers. Like, it starts there too. Like, if I remember in school, like, there was one time a teacher told me I would probably end up being a hooker because of my black skin, because of my queer identity, because I had resistance to that class. That's not okay. That is what's being instilled into that. The school to prison pipeline, let's talk about it. Like, there's like actions, like capitalists and like business ventures want that to happen. They want it to like have resource officers in the schools. They like want you to think that like you can't aspire to be anything other than commit crime. Food deserts, let's talk about that. Let's talk about why there's a whole bunch of liquor stores. I can walk to like 4 liquor stores in my neighborhood and the same amount, probably sooner than I can get to a grocery store that is filled with enough like actual food products for a decent meal for me to have. Maybe not. Aldi's is closer. No, because that liquor store, my mom's looking at me. No, it's so true. You know, why don't we have a bank why do we only have loaning systems in our next to Aldi's and not an actual bank? Let's talk about that. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's a combination of like, and it is, we can look at like from an ecology standpoint, we can look at it as a habitat. Like, if you're in a food desert where you can get liquor before you can get a decent meal, where there's like police officers who are not decently trained, like in the queer communities, like when domestic violences are called, there are like policies and like trainings police officers go through, which basically say just take the person who in a binary system who seems more masculine in a domestic violence case. That is not okay. That is perpetrating systems. Like it's policy change, it's lack of representation, it's the you can see it from all fronts. It's a million fronts. It comes from classism. It comes from the way we word legislation. It comes from, I think, we could get so, I need to be here 5 hours with you. Let's just talk afterwards. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a combination of long-term and short-term solutions when you talk about how do you hold systems accountable, how do you invoke the kind of systemic change that hopefully will then trickle down into reductions in violence or state violence. Some of the long-term solutions I think Zim already touched on, representation is huge. I think the reality is if your teachers identify with your experience, if your police officers identify with your experience, live in your neighborhoods, are from your neighborhoods, your judges, your juries, the better those systems represent the people that they are supposed to be servicing, the better and more empathetic they are going to be to this holistic picture of where perpetrators or victims are coming from, the less they will default to whatever they were acculturated to believe about the person in front of them. And we're not there yet. And unfortunately, I don't think even really aggressive policies are going to get us there right now. I'm seeing encouraging policies being put in place, but I think we need to demand and really challenge this idea that accelerated attempts to increase representation and diversity is somehow contrary to hiring the best candidate, because I don't believe that's true. And I think that that can be a knee-jerk defensiveness from white male leadership or white female leadership or cis-bodied leadership, whatever it is. There's resistance to accelerating the pace at which we do that. Shorter term solutions, and I will repeat the disclaimer that I am not here on behalf of my employer, but I do see a lot of encouraging things coming from rapid revolutionary grassroots activists like Zim, like Joby. I think that the more pressure younger people, I mean, they need support from older people too. There are economic costs to being out on the street or to getting arrest records, and so the rest of the community, if you don't support the tactics, but you support the outcome or the issues, then you need to find a way to support the people who are willing to put themselves in those situations. I think that that's challenging for people. The other short-term solution is demanding accountability when there is bad action. There are good transparency laws in place for government actors. There are not good transparency rules for private actors when we have systems that betray your rights or hurt you. And a lot of, from the legal standpoint, if you are brave enough to become a plaintiff and sue a company that has hurt your civil rights or created violent systems, a lot of them settle, and a lot of that's confidential. And then it just can keep going business as usual. So I think we need to increase transparency and accountability from city council up to federal government, and in the meantime just try to get more people on city council up to federal government who look and act like the communities that are affected so that they understand who they're helping.
You know, one of the things that I think about accountability is clearly sort of larger formal systems and how they affect everyone. But I also think about accountability as how do you get your community to take responsibility for it too. So years ago, we ended up doing these community insights and talking about domestic violence and GLBTQ community. And as we had conversations, the outside conversation was, when we did these focus groups, is that people wanted to talk about the harm that society did to them and the hate crimes that occurred. They didn't want to talk about domestic violence, though. So, and interpersonal relationships and violence, so much. Although there was a person that I knew that was a practitioner in St. Paul that had a GLBTQ domestic violence group. And they talked about how a perspective about doing that work pushed them away from trying to do the work because it wasn't a part of the traditional dynamic as people thought about it and explanations for it. So having the conversation within the group is something that's important. There's an organization called the Pipeline Project that's in New York that spends time with GLBTQ communities to have conversations. Office on Violence Against Women and HHS is trying to fund something where it's going to be another national resource center to be able to take a look at that. But The other thing too is within, let's say, the African American community or Native American communities. Native American communities have so many issues that they deal with that it's kind of picking and choosing which challenge you want to focus on. We know that because of the work that we did in Indian country, looking at the issues of supervised visitation centers and issues of domestic violence in the Indian country. And so getting people to buy into addressing the issue is important, but there are a number of Native American battered women's organizations and sexual assault organizations that give attention to it. Within the African American community, we were trying to work with different urban leagues across the United States because it's our issue. And the Urban League has historically been a place that has tried to address different challenges from the community. And health is one of the issues. But what's been interesting is that there's a lot of attention dealing with the challenges from without. And I know because I'm a black man that grew up dealing with these challenges myself, so I know that they're real and that they're true. But it's as important to deal with the challenges from within. So if we're doing things to hurt and harm ourselves, there's got to be a strategy about how do you approach that and how you deal with those circumstances. And we've gotten a few, particularly one in Boston, and the one that's developing in West Hartford, Connecticut, and one that's out in Detroit and a few other places and that are developing and are interested in it, that are trying to develop an approach to address the issue. But sometimes what's interesting is when you talk about violence among African Americans, sometimes, clearly there's a lot of African American battered women and men who give attention to the issue. But one of the things is that sometimes the choice is, well, we'll deal with community violence, or we deal with gang violence, or we deal with issues where young men are being killed. And sometimes what happens is you don't deal with intimate partner violence. I don't think you can make a choice. I think you have to deal with it all. But you also have to see the interconnections with the different issues. Or if you're dealing with immigrant and refugee communities, we're dealing with African communities. How do you end up having conversations with people who are elders or clan leaders or people who have status, or imams or ministers, who can give the proper guidance to the issue, but also challenge different ways that people look at the world. So if you know that sometimes men can come into the country and have more than one wife. Now, I'm just saying that some people say, don't focus on that. But you should deal with the conflict that exists within there. But also issues about males and females' roles. And that much older men can marry much younger women. And there's conflict that ensues because of that. And that if you try to reframe it, then you're being seen as somebody that's accepting Western eyes rather than trying to understand the values and traditions and history about why things got developed as they were. But the thing that's similar is that it still subordinates women and it still harms women. And if you don't understand those stories, how can you be effective in terms of working with the community? So as we have these issues about accountability, one of the things that we have to do is to try to figure out how to deal with it within each of our communities and have support to do that. And we talk about macro systems because that's what we can get our hands around. And it's the thing that when we talk, and I do think rising tides floats all boats. I think that's helped us in different parts of the world. What happens is that you usually have attorneys that fight to challenge laws around domestic violence, and they have to go to private foundations to be able to do that. So I do believe that the Violence Against Women Act helped to change the issue within the United States. And I also think pro-arrest policies have been useful in terms of dealing with. But years ago, when in the Clinton administration, when Eric Holder was the assistant attorney general under Janet Reno, they had a meeting where they asked, so how are we doing? And people felt really good about the things that happened. But one of the things that they said too was, well, maybe looking at law enforcement as the only approach, as a primary approach, isn't the only thing that we should do. That we should not only do that, but you've got to find ways that, where you end up looking at other approaches, because there used to be a period of time before they had pro-arrest policies and they sent men to batterers intervention programs, that you had people that came socially mandated. And that meant their wives and their girlfriends and their mothers and their aunts and sometimes their uncles and fathers told them that they needed to go get help. And when they changed the laws a little bit, what happened was you saw a higher increase of men of color that came in. And the other thing that was interesting too was that the socially mandated programs almost got eliminated. So we don't need one approach, we need both approaches.
I'm sorry, just really quickly too, I think that I want to build upon what you're saying about accountability. I think too, what you're getting at is that how do we hold ourselves accountable when some of the internalized oppressions we face are validated and celebrated? How do we talk about the patriarchy, or how do we talk about masculinity if harmful traits of masculinity are celebrated? As a trans man who is super femme, I know that it's sometimes hard to be femme because some of the other trans men I know are wait, if you're acting like the B word, why don't you just stay the B word? And these are other trans men, or even in communities of color, being black as well as native. I know that sometimes it's it can be super hard to be oh, well, why are you doing X, Y, and Z? Why are you acting white? Well, why is it a good education, or why is caring about this, or why is pushing back against white people and using the language that they use a white thing? So when we hold ourselves accountable, I think that it can be very hard because we have to directly go against traits, behaviors, policies that have been celebrated for years, that have been celebrated in our own communities, and that sometimes we celebrate ourselves. I know that sometimes I look in the mirror and have to be oh my gosh, I have been celebrating this toxic trait because it has been giving me privilege in myself. So how am I going to actually give up this privilege that I have in order to stop being so toxic and to hurt myself and to hurt my community? What privileges do I specifically need to give up in order to hold myself accountable and make my community better?
Can I make one comment? Is that okay? Such a great conversation. I wanted to bring it back a little bit to the university. And I wanted to point out that I think I'm so glad we've had this conversation about some of the ways that violence plays out in very specific ways in communities of color and immigrant communities, et cetera, and trans, queer communities, and how that's related to racism and transphobia, et cetera. And I also want to notice that when we focus on violence in communities of color, it's very tempting to I guess what I want to say is I'm not convinced there's less violence in Edina than there is in North Minneapolis. But I think we are very good, particularly when wealth is involved, but also whiteness, at finding ways to move away from violence and to not notice it. And what I want to point out is that, yes, there are crimes that happen in Dinkytown, but the majority of sexual assaults and rapes that happen on campus don't happen in Dinkytown on the street. They happen among people who know each other. And I want to point out, I was thinking about these fraternities that have a parade that says, with a big banner that says, no means yes and yes means anal. I mean, it's hard for me to say those words. And those are young white men, mostly middle class, very privileged. And yet it's so tempting to look at violence in communities of color. And I just feel like it's really important to me to bring us back as a community to say there's tremendous amounts of violence that we just write off as boys being boys. And that really means white boys being white boys. And that really means middle class white boys being middle class white boys. And that's rape and that's violence. And I just feel compelled to bring us back to what happens here that we don't notice, right under our own eyes. What bullying happens in our departments, what bullying happens between faculty and staff and students. And I know that Julie deals with that every day as the director of the Office for Conflict Resolution, and that it's not just in those communities. I mean, it's a both-and model, but I just feel compelled to kind of throw that out there. I know we're running out of time, so that's not very fair. But if anybody wants to say anything.
I'd love to, because the last time I was on campus was about a month ago for live blogging an event where a student group had brought in 2 speakers, pundits who essentially take the position that rape culture does not exist, feminism is toxic to the world, men are entitled to have sex the way they want to have sex, and asking for consent is completely axiomatic and contrary to having a good sex life. And the crowd was about 200 young white men. I don't think I saw any people of color. Many of them were current college students, and some had driven in from the wealthy suburbs to celebrate these excellent speakers for their wonderful views on how overreacting women are to the problem of sexual violence and to campus rape. And I don't think the university needs to bar a marketplace of ideas from coming, but in terms of when I left that event, I was concerned for the people on campus that their male classmates were going to return to their dorms, return to their frats, having been recently emboldened by this messaging. And so you're absolutely right. I think that it is very attractive to say that, well, this is a problem when the police get called and when people are handcuffed and taken away. But if you watch some of the research that's coming out on campus sexual violence, it is largely privileged middle-class white men who, it does come from this culture of entitlement. So we have to be the countervailing force. I think you mentioned earlier the importance of education, and that's why I think that we cannot hit that issue hard enough, that for every speaker we bring in who promotes this culture, we need speakers who promote a healthy and different culture.
I think too, like, I think you were really getting to that point too when you were talking about, like, well, who has the money for a lawyer? Like, when someone comes in, like, who has the money to actually say, like, oh, well, in this domestic violence case, it was X, Y, and Z, and I have enough money to get that. So I think you were really touching upon that point. And then two, I think we cannot talk about privilege enough and talk about, like, systemic oppression enough in these scenarios, in these cases, because it is true. Like, how many times and points are, like, people of color just like a pinpoint just to move the story along, or just to, like, to prove a point? And how come that does not happen for white men? And how come like statistics on white men, just like the points you made, aren't talked about more? I think it's a privilege and an entitlement thing you were talking about, as well as a class thing that you were talking about, like who has enough money and who has resources to avoid this research. Like who, like, let's really talk about the research we're doing, and even how, like, as academics or even an institution, like how are we funneling the system? How are we allowing that? And going to your point of, like, just because someone has a speaker and credentials, do they need to be here on our campus? Let's talk about that. Like, what gives you the right? Like, just like, yeah, I could go into it more and get even more radical, but that's enough.
Okay, so we have one more question.
Yeah, I'll be really quick since I know we're past time, so thanks. I wanted to just say one of the things that concerns me is not just the amount of violence, but the amount of threats of violence, and how I feel like that's become a default. And Dallas brought up social media, and I feel like, how did we get to a point where we live in a culture where if someone says something you don't agree with, you go on social media and you say, I'm going to kill you. Or if a woman says something you don't agree with, you go on social media and you say, I'm going to rape you. How do we make it so that that's not okay? Because I feel like even if most of the people that say those things would never actually do them, that shows me how deep the culture of violence is, that's like a default go-to response when someone makes you mad. You threaten to rape or kill them.
Well, as a person who recently went to the police with a report of a rape threat that I will find your address and I'm going to find you and rape you, I can tell you that the sympathetic police officer I spoke with said, this is definitely illegal. Here's the statute. It's a terroristic threat. We do not have the resources to deal with this. So I actually don't fall on the camp that we need to criminally deal with what I think is largely a social, cultural problem. I actually didn't want to go to the police. Family encouraged me to, but I don't see that as the solution. I think your question is, how did we get there? I think that it is just an expression of feelings that have been kind of lurking under the surface for a long time. I certainly think pure anonymity has an aspect of that, when people are not just divorced from their own online identity, but also refusing to see the people on the other side of the account as a real person with family, with concerns, with safety, entitlement, And so I think part of it is going to be pressuring those platforms to take this more seriously. The things that they do and don't ban, for instance, the particular person who made this threat was only suspended until they deleted that message and then allowed to continue having this account. And I think Twitter and Facebook are capitalist companies that get a lot of benefit from high traffic, and so really to them, safety plays a role, but not until it reaches a tipping point where people don't use them. That said, I think the by and large majority of feelings that I get from social media are very positive, very connective. So I'm not at a point where I'm depressed by it, but I do think that there was an article that came out in which a woman confronted her spouse or partner because she'd found his online traffic and found he was cyberbullying a young girl. And I think in this story, whether it was legit or just kind of an exercise, the story ended with her breaking up with him because he was unable to stop doing it. And so I think to the extent parents talk to their kids about, well, you have to share your toys and you have to behave this way, that conversation has to start including, you have to treat human beings like human beings on the internet. And if it's your boyfriend or girlfriend and you know they use Reddit and Twitter a lot, I think you need to hold them accountable. Those aren't just words, those are words with a lot of meaning and humanity behind them.
And the educational piece there too, it's pretty well studied and well documented now that the use of electronic communication tools is associated with reduced adherence to social norms, right? And the sense that it isn't real, when in fact the damage that it does is quite real. So I think we have to sum up because we're done, but what I want to say again is thanks to each of you, this conversation, like every conversation we have here and in this space, calls forth powerful voices, not just powerful voices from the panel, but powerful voices for the community. And it creates an opportunity for connections. And ultimately, I think what all of you have said in one way or another is that until we embrace the idea that an act of violence towards one is an injury to all, we won't successfully change the culture that we live in. So, thanks each of you for your strong voices.